Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's kickoff in an election series. We're going to provide a preview of the 2020 elections tonight, and I am excited to be here with Professor Scott Boddery and Professor Bruce Larson, both from the Political Science Department here at Gettysburg College. Professor Boddery is an expert in American political institutions and judicial politics. His research focuses on the federal judiciary's politicization at the hands of both governmental and non-governmental actors. Professor Larson is a scholar of American political institutions and processes. His research and teaching focus on the U.S. Congress, political parties and elections, and the politics of public policy. I am Professor Beth Campbell-Hetrick in the Mathematics Department, and I'm excited to join these two scholars tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Larson to get us started.
Thank you, Beth. I appreciate the introduction. Thanks, Scott. And what Beth hasn't told you all about herself is that while in the mathematics department, she teaches some really cool courses on gerrymandering and so on. I often wish during these times that I had chosen mathematics for our field, but Beth, as a mathematician, has come over to study politics. So that's pretty cool. I thought I would start by making us all relive the 2016 campaign for a few minutes. Sorry to have to do this to people for whom it didn't turn out the way you wanted. Just basically make the point about uncertainty in campaigns and so on. So political scientists generally see presidential outcomes as a function of two things, of what they call the fundamentals. This is sort of the state of the economy and the approval of the president, or as in 2016, the outgoing president, right? President Obama, because this was an open seat in 2016. And the second thing is the campaigns and their strategies. Political scientists love the fundamentals. They don't put enough stake in campaigns, but campaigns matter. But in 2016, interestingly enough, right, the state of the economy and evaluations of Obama predicted a national popular vote victory, albeit a close one, for Hillary Clinton. And of course, that's what happened, right? With Clinton winning 48% of the national vote to 46% for Trump. The problem, of course, is that a candidate wins a presidential election not by winning the national popular vote, but by winning the Electoral College vote. So it's not at all clear why we are so obsessed with national polls, but we are. And of course, in the Electoral College, Trump prevailed handily, right? Winning 304 Electoral College votes to Clinton's 227. There were a couple of faithless electors on each side who supported candidates other than Trump and Clinton. The election was incredibly close, right? A shift of some 77,000 voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin would have put Clinton in the White House. And that's our point one, right? Elections are won and lost at the margins, and this is where campaigns can make a difference. There are lots of, campaign-centered explanations for the 2016 outcome. I've lost track of them. Some have a great deal of empirical support, some have some, but some of these are, like, for example, one popular explanation attributes Clinton's loss to the fact that her campaign paid insufficient attention to Wisconsin and Michigan, showing up in these states only once or maybe twice in the period between winning the primary and the general election. Wisconsin and Michigan are really important states for Democrats. They each have sizable and important populations of Black voters and white working class voters as well. And meanwhile, right, the Clinton campaign was spending resources in Arizona trying to flip a state that has admittedly become a lot more accommodating terrain for Democrats. This explanation doesn't put Clinton at the center, but rather her campaign team. Other analysts noted Clinton's somewhat weak support among white women voters. I went back to look at these statistics, and while Clinton won large margins among Black, Latinx, and Asian American women, she lost handily to Trump, 53 to 43% among white women. So, you know, doing better among white women could have changed this outcome. Other explanations highlight the Trump campaign's ability to tap into economic anxiety, especially among white working class voters, worried about losing manufacturing jobs. And others still attribute his victory to his willingness to run an unabashedly anti-immigration campaign, right? Using xenophobic rhetoric to activate the fears among white voters about immigrants and the increasing diversity of the country. So I guess the point here is that while the fundamentals matter, I think in any close election, any number of decisions about strategy, about vote targeting, about mobilization can potentially change the outcome of a campaign, of an election. I think that whatever the outcome of the 2016 election, and we're going to lay this to rest now, we won't have to talk about it anymore. We are at a really different point 4 years later, right? A lot has happened since 2016. I was thinking about some of these things. The women's marches, I mean, the day after Trump was inaugurated, there was a march of probably 1 million people in Washington, D.C., one of the first women's marches. And the Me Too movement, the strong Democratic showing in the 2018 midterm elections, which I would add was fueled mainly by women candidates. COVID-19, of course, and the economic fallout from it. And of course, then the very intense Black Lives Matter protests of the past summer. And we can talk about all of those things. I want to stress one point here for the purposes of looking at this election. I think the most important contextual change right now is that Trump is running as an incumbent. He's not running as an open seat outsider anymore. One truism about elections is that the candidate who can define what the election is about, the candidate who wins the election. Let me say that again, right? The candidate who can define what the election is about is the candidate who wins the election. Another truism is that when an incumbent president is running for re-election, the election is mainly about him. In other words, it's a referendum on the incumbent's performance. Or so that's the way it's been. Deservedly or not, right? Presidents get credit for good national conditions, things like peace and prosperity, and they get blamed when things are not going well, even if it's not their fault. And so along these lines, and I'll qualify this in a minute, I think it will be difficult for Trump to overcome the nearly 175,000 COVID deaths, right, and the 10.3% unemployment rate. The important thing is, though, that Trump knows this, right? I think he understands that his best chance of winning in November is to change what the election is about. And I think this is why we see a kind of law and order campaign, focusing on what he is describing as chaos and anarchy and vandalism in cities like Portland and Kenosha, Wisconsin. The Biden campaign, for its part, will hammer away at the COVID numbers and the economy, I suspect. Let me take 1 more minute, since I've laid out this, and qualify the conventional wisdom, right, that voters tend to hold incumbents responsible for bad conditions, for unfavorable national conditions. And I think it's a qualification that adds some uncertainty to the mix. So a lot of the research establishing this trend, right, that voters will hold that elections that have an incumbent president are a referendum on the incumbent's performance. A lot of that research is of course, right, from past elections. But a lot has been changing about the country. And what I mean in particular is that partisan attitudes have significantly hardened, right? And we have these information silos now that have allowed people to receive news and perspectives that only that they want to see, right? And for the most part, that reinforce what they already believe. There doesn't appear to be that many swing voters or persuadable voters out there. And to be honest, you know, if you look at some public opinion research out there, a lot of Trump supporters don't actually see things as bad, right? And they see Biden as a worse choice. Trump won't get, I can tell you this now, and doesn't need a popular vote majority. He needs only to win the Electoral College vote. Because partisan attitudes are hardened, I think the strategy of sort of changing what the campaign's about, and of course, voter mobilization will sort of dictate how this election goes. And let me stress that, right? With few persuadable voters out there, I think what the campaigns are going to focus on is mobilizing existing supporters rather than dumping a lot of resources into changing minds. Again, it's not as if there's no swing voters out there, but there are fewer swing voters than in the past. And that puts a premium on mobilizing the supporters that you have that are out there, getting them fired up to vote and so on. And last thing I want to point out before I open this up a little bit and we have more of a conversation about it, is of course there are several extremely important House and Senate contests out there as well, right? These things tend to get especially House contests, tend to get overshadowed by a presidential contest. But in fact, what happens in these races also is critical, is central to the direction the country moves after November. So I thought I could turn it over to Scott and Beth for a second, and you could ask some questions, or you could continue on this conversation, and we can take it in a couple of different directions.
Thanks, Bruce. I want to first welcome everyone, and then also, just as a point of information, we want to make this a little more conversational. So if you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat box, we'll field them, and hopefully answer them as they come in. So please don't hesitate to reach out via the chat. And with that said, I want to underscore Bruce's point about mobilization. I can't tell you how incredibly important it is. There is a famous piece of political science research by Anthony Downs, and it's called The Economic Theory of Democracy, and it's fascinating. And I love beginning my semesters with this sort of thought experiment, because what Anthony Downs tells us, and he's right, is that from a purely economic standpoint, voting is irrational. And so the decision to vote is equal to your impact on that election and the effort it takes to get to the polls. And that's what he says. And he says it takes an awful lot of effort to get to the polls. And an election, I used to be able to say this until 2 years ago, an election is never decided by a single vote. And so therefore, voting's irrational. And that might strike us as a little insulting, because I assume if you're here, you're interested in politics, and you think, well, no, this is obviously wrong. But I think that's exactly why it's so important, because he is wrong. We know that folks go out and vote. And so then the question becomes why? Why do they go out and vote? And then the follow-up question then is, well, what variable is missing? What is the impact here? Because it's more than just my vote's going to win candidate X this election. There's something missing, and that thing that's missing is this sense of civic duty. People have a sense of civic duty, and so what I like to refer to as the couch variable, right? When you're a candidate and you're trying to mobilize your voters, you're trying to reduce the impact of that couch variable. Because if it's a rainy day and the polls are saying that your favorite candidate is a surefire loser, you're not going to get up off your couch. And so for a candidate, then your question is, how do I adjust that equation? And political scientists have spent a lot of time trying to figure this out. And there's some really cool research out there, some of which was used in 2016. If you remember back to the Iowa caucus, Ted Cruz, he sent out voter report cards. And these voter report cards, the idea behind it is based on a piece of political science research about voter mobilization. And what these voter report cards say is, well, you get it in the mail and it says, hey, you know, voting's really important. It's a civic duty. And by the way, we looked at the records and you haven't voted in the last 7 elections and you have an F. And so you might think, oh yeah, thanks, and throw it away in the trash. But then if you read one step further, it says, oh, and by the way, here are your neighbors' grades and how often they voted. And by the way, they got your grade also. So maybe you should think about voting in this election. And the results of this it's remarkable. It's an uptick of upwards of 15% of difference if you get this sort of, for lack of a better term, neighborhood shaming, right? You're being shamed by your neighbor or in your neighborhood to think, oh, I better go and do this. It's important. And if you put yourselves in the candidate's shoes for a second, if you ask yourself whether the cost of a stamp to mail out this voter report card is worth it, at the other end is an uptick of 12, 15%, the answer is absolutely yes. And so there's a bunch of research about mobilization across the board. It's really fascinating stuff. And the other interesting aspect, I think, that piggybacks off of what happened in 2016 was this notion of the polls, right? The polls had Hillary Clinton, I think the New York Times at one point was in a 90-something% chance of winning a few nights before the election. And so again, if we think about this in terms of voter mobilization, if we think about that couch variable, right? We go back to Anthony Downs, and you either support Hillary or you support Trump, and it's a surefire thing that Hillary is going to win. How many Hillary supporters stayed home because they thought, well, it's in the bag? Or how many Trump voters stayed home because they thought, well, it's not going to matter? Right?
That's a great point, Scott. Beth, you want to chime in, or can I?
Well, no, go ahead, Bruce. You go ahead with what your idea is now.
I just wanted to point out, and a friend said this to me the other day, and who knows a lot about probability, and he was very critical of course, the Nate Silver machine that turns out likely probabilities of a candidate victories, right? And so, like right now, you know, Biden has a 70% chance of winning the election. I forget what it was for Clinton. It was, I think, somewhat similar. But really what that means, this is what that means. It means if you ran the election 100 times, Biden would win 70 of them. We don't have 100 elections. We have 1. And you got to vote in that 1, right? These probabilities, we get obsessed with these probabilities, and you know, they're presented in a way as if this would almost happen deterministically without the campaigns out there mobilizing votes, and without voters getting off the couch, as Scott points out. The other thing that's going to change, I think, and that's going to be really difficult in this election, is how do we mobilize voters? Like, the absolute gold standard for vote mobilization, and all the research shows this, is door-to-door campaigning. It's a conversation with people, and the more personal, the better. These robotic calls that do phone banking have no effect at all. But door-to-door canvassing, when you can have a conversation with people, they work. They boost voter turnout, and they're a way to help your preferred candidate. But how do we do that in a pandemic? And that will be very challenging. I worry about voter turnout in this election because of that. We may have fewer people staffing polls, depending on what the virus is looking like later on in the fall. And so that's a concern. It's really important for people to figure out, to get a plan to vote and figure out how to do that. The campaigns will no doubt be trying to come up with some innovative tactics, but we're going to lose, I suspect, one of the main drivers of voter turnout, and that is that door-to-door campaign.
With regard to polling, another one of the things I'm looking forward to see how it plays out this election is how the polls actually perform, because prior to 2016, they were pretty good. The models that they're built on had a long history of, informed theoretical building for these models. And so when 2016 happened, this is why they were so far off, is because the assumptions that went into this model building were, well, a bit haywire. So whereas we would normally expect people of a certain demographic category or income level or education level to vote a certain way, they were just wrong. And that had a lot to do with the two candidates that were running. In the history of presidential races, they were the two most unpopular candidates ever. And so the question is, have the polls learned their lesson? Have they adjusted their assumptions? Because if you look at these polls, and I think it's really important, first, of course, you want to look at the standard, the margin of error that the polls claim. And I went on the record back in 2016, and I'll go on it again now. I really wouldn't put much stock into any poll with a margin of error of something less than 5 or 6. That's how kind of uncertain we are right now in these times. But if you look, almost always the polls say, well, our margin of error is 2.5, 3.5, and that's awfully low. And I don't know if the model has been adjusted well enough to have a margin of error that low just yet. I think there's still too much in flux. And so it'll be really interesting to see. I mean, those of you, I'm gonna gloss over the gritty details, but we usually only poll about 1,200 people. That's about the point of diminishing returns. And what we do is we extrapolate from there. And so we poll 1,200 people, and we know the basic demographic makeup of the United States. And so we extrapolate from those 1,200 and assume that folks who are alike are going to vote alike. And that's one lesson from 2016 that I'm looking to see what happens in 2020.
There are a couple of things that have come up here in the last couple of minutes that I'd love to jump in on, and again, turn things back out to you. First, Scott, I want to tell you, I got one of those voter report cards in the 2018 election. I got a postcard in the mail, I got a grade, and it had—
What was your grade, Beth?
I did well. I've got that sense of civic duty. I think I got an A on my voter report card, and my neighbors were on the report card by name. Your neighbor, so-and-so down the street, gets a B, and your other neighbor a couple blocks away, so-and-so, gets this other grade. So in 2018, they were mailing them out in Pennsylvania. Another thing that I'm thinking about, you mentioned the decision to vote, what goes into getting you off the couch. You mentioned the effort to get to the polls. I am teaching a first-year seminar class on the mathematics of voting. Bruce alluded to this in the beginning. And the first day of class, we talked about what we want to be true about our elections. What do we want our elections to be? And many of the students talked about accessibility to vote, ability for people to be able to vote. And there are so many factors that go into that. Pennsylvania has just had a major change to laws around elections and voting. For the first time this year, we're able to vote by mail-in ballot without needing an excuse for an absentee ballot, for example. And this is a conversation. Mail-in ballots themselves are, have been a topic in the news quite a bit lately. There have also been recent decisions related to the Voting Rights Act. And so many different things here. I wonder what either one of you are thinking about some of these things, accessibility to voting, early voting, mail-in voting. Which are the demographic groups maybe most affected by this? What impacts will these have on voter turnout? Those sorts of things.
I think on that, if I could jump in here, Scott, and I'll let you'll know more about the actual case than I will. But one of the issues here is changes in state law, and states control most of their laws about voting, whether we have early voting, mail-in ballots, and so on. And changes in state law can make things more difficult to vote as well, right? And one thing that happened in 2013 is that the Supreme Court struck down a very narrow part, the formula for pre-clearance in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And basically, this acted as a shield. What it said was that covered states covered by the original VRA, which tended to be mostly in the Deep South, but also some cities in the North, had to submit to the Justice Department or the DC Court of Appeals, right, any changes in voting practices and electoral redistricting and so on. And, you know, the Department of Justice objected to many of these such changes over the years. And the intent of the preclearance provision in the Voting Rights Act was the protection of minority voters. Section 2 still allows voters to wage voting rights suits. Okay, it's more like a sword rather than a shield. But having the court strike down Section 5, I think, leaves less protection for voters in states that don't necessarily want to expand the number of voters. And so that's one issue I think we're dealing with now, that states have a lot more latitude in passing things like voting rights laws, voter ID laws and so on. And that has the potential to drive down turnouts in some states. And it's not only in the South, of course. And,
yeah, the equation that was used, it primarily affected the South, but as Bruce said, I mean, it was even at the county level at some places.
Yes.
The equation that was used in the Voting Rights Act was, if they had a voting test on the books when the Voting Rights Act was passed in '64 or when it was being crafted, and voter turnout in that area was less than 50%, then what it meant was it didn't necessarily mean that place couldn't change its laws. It just had to get approval before it did so. And so the federal government stepped in. So rather than having affected voters be injured and then have to go to court to prove their case, it reversed the equation that made the state or the area go to court first to prove that it wasn't discriminatory or wouldn't reduce voter turnout. And so it really gave the Voting Rights Act its teeth. That was the mechanism by which it actually became effective. And what happened in Shelby County versus Holder not so long ago is the court just struck that down because, and to be fair, Section 5 on its face targeted very specific places and didn't target other places. And so, okay, that's not equal protection of the law. That's not due process, is what the court says, is what Roberts said. And so they got rid of it and they said, times have changed, we don't need it anymore. And almost the very next day, states who were previously under Section 5 began changing their voter ID laws or introducing new voter ID laws or changing voting requirements. And so truly the very next day after the Supreme Court struck this down, these states started doing practices that really did affect turnout. And so I think it's a reasonable question to ask, well, if the Supreme Court has ruled on it, how can we possibly undo it? And I think that the answer is, if we can, again, this might be slightly wishful thinking, but if we simply just don't target certain states and have the entire country under the same preclearance law, I think that's one possible solution short of a constitutional amendment, which is awfully difficult to pass, as we all know. So that's one possible workaround for sure.
I'm going to just point out here too that the last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was passed 98-0 in the Senate, signed by President George W. Bush, and passed with only 33 opposing members in the House. I mean, as we talked about, you know, it's difficult to get that sort of consensus even on, you know, renaming a post office. So this was something that there was a lot of agreement on, but that the court struck down. And it really does, you know, my first order of business, if I was running the country, would be to reauthorize that law. Beth also had brought up questions about mail-in ballots, because this has taken on special importance, right? If we do have another outbreak of the virus, what happens if people don't want to go to the polls? And a lot of states are offering the ability to apply for mail-in balloting. I live in Maryland, and I just got an application, unsolicited. I didn't ask for it. I got instructions on how to go on the web and get a mail-in ballot if I want. There's been some controversy about that, claims about voter fraud and so on under it. I would point out here that there are at least 3 states that have done exclusively mail-in balloting for many, many years now. And that includes, those states include Colorado and Washington and Oregon. Oregon, I believe, has been doing it since the late 90s, actually. So for states that do want to go to complete mail-in balloting, we should look to those states. They're the model right now. Nobody has made any kinds of claims of voter fraud for these states. So, while certainly this is an issue, and I would want states to have a good model in place before doing this, it's something that I'm hopeful will be available to voters if possible. Because quite frankly, some voters would rather not go and stand in a line in a polling place and turn out this year.
Beth, I also got a voter report card when I first moved here, and I got an F because it said I hadn't voted in any recent elections.
Because you just gotten here?
Yeah, and I was really bummed. I wanted to go and explain to my neighbors that I'm usually a good citizen and I usually go and vote. With regard to mobilization too, I think it's interesting to look at how lower offices go about this. So when funds are tight, when they don't have a big war chest to dip into, we're talking local races now too. Quite often, one of the most effective things that these candidates do is to rent a bus and to drive around neighborhoods and say, do you want to ride to the polls? And on the ride, they tell them about what they stand for. Just today, actually, I think I was on Instagram and I saw an ad for a local election that had a free Uber code. So if you needed a ride to the polls, here was your code, and you'd get a free ride. So really interesting things happening on lower levels too.
I'll add here, lastly, that mobilization efforts are increasingly and especially important for newer voters, for younger voters who vote at much lower rates than older cohorts. And I think also for recent citizens, newer voters, voters of color, Latino voters, voter turnout rate tends to be lower among these groups. And campaigns can change that by the way that they campaign, right? They can, and a lot of campaigns do this, Republican and Democrat, will put campaigns out in Spanish language campaigns and campaign advertisements. Those kinds of things are really helpful for driving up voter turnout. I mean, what the idea, right? We want turnout to look like the country, and it's a long way off from that, right? It's highly correlated with socioeconomic status and with age. And so any way that candidates can reach out, and campaigns are very risk averse. They tend to reach out to voters who have been out before, right? Candidates and campaigns, anytime you have new voters in the system, it creates uncertainty. So a lot of candidates are like, let's just do what we did in the past. But candidates and campaigns could help drive up voter turnout by making specific efforts to tailor their messaging to groups who haven't turned out as high in the past. And that's something I hope to see both parties thinking about moving forward. I'm not sure we'll see that much of it in this election, but my hope is that kind of thing would happen moving forward. Ideally, right, you want every group to be up for grabs. You want the parties to go out and compete for everyone's vote, for every group's vote. To the extent that that doesn't happen, a group becomes electorally captured, right? We take its vote for granted. And so ideally, each party would make a play for a wider spectrum of voters than is currently the case. Other points and questions? Beth, did you want to ask anything? I have so many things I can talk about, but I don't want to hog up the airspace.
Well, actually, I'm going to pivot a little bit, building on what you said about ideally wanting the voters to reflect the population. We want to get the voters, want to tap into all of these parties. And when I'm thinking about representation, I'm talking about representation at the polls of the voters, I'm thinking also about representation when it comes to the people who do vote and who is elected then. One of the topics that I've been very interested in the last couple of years is gerrymandering, the process by which we draw our political districts. And while this doesn't directly impact the presidential election, the impacts can be large, profound, some would argue, at the state levels. How are these district lines drawn? How is it that the state's population of voters might be majority Democrat, and yet their representatives in the House are majority Republican, sometimes by large margins, and several states have some great examples of this. In fact, just in 2018, Pennsylvania got a new map. So we have voted now, or coming up on our second election, under these newly redrawn lines after our map was ruled unconstitutional. So what do either one of you think about this? We've got a census year right now. It's 2020, so the census is ongoing. We are set for redistricting in 2021. What do you think? What's happening? What might happen? How much of a role is that going to be in this election? Are people talking about it now? Has it been overshadowed maybe by some other big things going on?
I think it's been overshadowed, but I think one thing to think about is that the midterm elections of 2018 produced significant Democratic victories in state houses. And it's state houses almost, often that draw district lines, not only for state legislative races, but for congressional seats as well. And so,
True.
Yeah, so what happens, it's interesting, what happens in these midterm elections sometimes determines what happens in congressional elections for the next decade or so.
Yes.
There's certainly been a movement towards more independent commissions and so on to kind of remove the ability for map makers to use partisan data in drawing maps, right? A bunch of states have experimented with these, including California and I believe Arizona as well.
Yeah.
I think these can pay off, right? You never want to have a situation where if you added up, for example, all of Pennsylvania's votes for the US House of Representatives, and 55% of those votes went to Democrats and 45% for Republicans, but Republicans still had a majority of the seats in Congress, right? And that does happen often in states. It's interesting, in 2000, I believe it was 2012, if you looked at Democratic House candidates, you added up all of the votes for that Democratic House candidates got nationally. It was a majority of the two-party vote. In other words, Democratic candidates got more votes for US House across the country than did Republican candidates. But they were still the minority party. Republicans got the majority of seats. To some extent, I think redistricting can help that. It certainly can. To some extent, I think, though, this is also a function of the two parties' constituency, right? We have, the Democratic Party tends to be a much more urban constituency now. Urban, also sort of kind of, immediate suburbs outside of the cities. And the Republican Party tends to be in more rural districts. So what happens is you have urban districts where the Democratic candidate for the House is getting 70 to 75% of the vote, but you're still only getting one House district, right? I mean, in theory, if you could spread those votes out and they weren't so concentrated, right, you would have less of a mismatch between seats won and votes won, or votes won and seats won. So to some extent, I think the issue is with the structure of the Democrats' constituents as well, but certainly more fair district line drawing can help. I live in a gerrymandered district in Maryland. It was a district that was once Republican, and the Democratic state legislature and governor in 2010 or 11, when they did it, broke the district up and added, it's a sprawling district that goes all the way from Western Maryland down to Germantown and Gaithersburg. They added a bunch of Democratic territory that the candidate in the 8th district didn't need because his district was so blue already. And they made it into a Democratic district. My district was one of the cases up in front of the court this year. So we'll see. This kind of thing happens at the state level, though, as well. There's not, as far as I can tell, any national legislation. There's very little national legislation or regulation that determines line drawing. But it's a hugely important issue.
Yeah, I will say that, ideally I'd like to rewind to 2008 for a minute, but I will say that I think some states, I'd like to view these state policies as small laboratories for policy experiments. And some states are doing it pretty well, and they're actually doing a bipartisan commission and drawing, not perfect, I don't know if it can ever be perfect, but much more fair as far as partisan representation. There's no doubt about that. But with regard to rewinding it to 2008, I know, forgive me if there are any of my students in the room right now, you've probably heard this before, but in 2008, there was an open White House and we had a Democrat win. And the closest thing I say that we have to a law is that at the midterms, what will happen is the losing party will mobilize out of anger or frustration. And that's what happened in 2010 when we saw the buildup of the Tea Party. And then that was on the state level too. And so those were the folks tasked with, in a census year, redrawing the lines. And so that brings us to where we are today, and everything that happened in between with the backlash of these extreme partisan gerrymandered districts. But again, another important aspect of 2020, right, is that this is a census year, and this is what the Constitution says is the trigger point for redrawing districts. I think it's that important in 2020.
Yeah, and that's a great point though, Scott, because what it also says is that in this year in particular, your vote to the extent that there are gubernatorial and state legislative elections in states, they're very meaningful this year because they're going to set the institutions in place that will decide on redistricting after the 2020 census. So when you think about voting for statewide state house candidates and state senate candidates, they often control the redistricting process.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would want to throw just one. Oh, I'm sorry, Beth, go on.
Well, I was going to say, I'm so glad you mentioned that because you're right. The decisions are made in the state houses. And as you said, there are decisions made for the state districts and the U.S. congressional districts. And they're made now. And the other thing I wanted to say, I'm so glad you brought up Maryland, because I know some of the most ardent supporters of reform in drawing district lines are quick to say that this is a nonpartisan issue, that either party will do this if given the chance.
Absolutely.
And they have brought up, in fact, that one of the obstacles to reform is that both parties might drag their feet when it comes time for actual reform, because there's also some sense of each party taking their turn. Maybe we don't have the control in Pennsylvania now, but maybe next time around it's our turn. We're waiting for our turn. I know that's something that I've been hearing. It's quite interesting.
And I would add just one last question here, and I guess at some point we'll want to break it open for questions from the audience. But one of the concerns that I get from my students a lot is the Electoral College itself, right? And of course, because the Electoral College overrepresents small states, right? Because of the way we allocate Electoral College votes, right? It's a number of House seats the state has plus those 2 extra Senate seats. So you tend to have overrepresentation of smaller states, and smaller states tend to be more rural, and they tend to also to be more white. And so there are outcomes associated with the Electoral College that a lot of people think are problematic. And so, my question is, and I'm not sure that we can answer this now, and it's possible that Trump could win another Electoral College victory while still, again, garnering 47% of the vote or something like that. To what extent, how many times can this happen, do you think, before this electoral system loses legitimacy? Or does it retain that legitimacy? In other words, do people expect the winner of a national presidential election to be the winner of the popular vote?
Yeah, I think it would be really tough, and I'm relating this to my research on court legitimacy, but I think it would be really tough for this system to survive 2 in a row where the popular vote winner lost. I really do think that would really put the system, I think it would have a groundswell of support. But of course, we'd have to pass an amendment to make that happen.
Right.
We're almost running out of time, so I wanted to kick it over to questions and answers. If you have any, please type them my way. I've received 2. One of them is about the courts, and if I feel that they've been overlooked. And I think you can probably guess what my answer is going to be, and it's absolutely yes, they're overlooked. But just to put a slightly finer point on it, we tend to really get excited for or only care about the Supreme Court, and I'm certainly guilty of that too. We have Ginsburg, who's 87, Breyer, who's 82, Thomas, who's 72. All of them have served for over 25 years, and so those are 3 possible departures relatively soon. But I think more importantly, I want to point out how many appointments presidents have on the lower court. So there are roughly 850 or so seats at the lower court levels, and by far they handle the universe of federal lawsuits. The Supreme Court hears less than 1% of the cases. And each 4-year term since Carter, presidents tend to have 200 placements on the federal court. And so to think that, he or she might get 2, possibly 2 placements on the Supreme Court, yeah, that's interesting. But I think far more important is, without fail, a president will have 200 appointees on the lower court, and they're the ones who see the vast majority of cases. And so the policy implications of that is tremendous. Let's say you appoint a 37, 38-year-old. That means that judge can possibly serve for 30 or 40 more years and have an impact on the jurisprudence of this country, and that far outshadows any 4-year term or 8-year term of any president.
And Scott, I would add to that the importance of your vote for U.S. Senate, if in fact you have a Senate seat up, right? Because for federal court judges, those require advice and consent, confirmation by the U.S. Senate, right? And so the party that holds Senate control has a big impact on this, especially how quickly these nominations to the federal courts move and so on.
I have one question here that says, is it the government's responsibility to make voting easy?
It's a great question.
Or just possible? I think it's a wonderful question.
That's an excellent question. I think we shouldn't make it difficult. And I think once we start saying it's not a problem, the problem with it being difficult is barriers to voting typically affect people unequally, right? People with more resources are able to vote and participate, and have more time to vote and participate than people with fewer resources. So I think the idea about making it easy, we want to lower the barriers for people who want to vote but who aren't voting for some reason. That would be my answer to that. I think it's a great question. I would hesitate to have laws that put barriers in place for people that really did want to vote and who were serious about it and so on.
Yeah, I'm going to call upon my Nana for this example. And I always go back to these laws that essentially, if they were in place not so long ago, my Nana would not have been able to vote. And that's a really sad thing. She's voted on every election since FDR. And I guess so when I hear this question, what I think of, when I look specifically at North Carolina's voter ID laws, I understand the argument that, oh, you need an ID to drive a car and this and that. And the question then becomes, why is the onus on the person in order to meet these requirements in order to go and vote? I think the Constitution in its tenor places the onus on the government. And so, yeah, it might be an extra step or a little bit extra money to make sure that those folks who are eligible to vote are able to vote. But the onus should not be on the individual to jump through hoops in order to prove something that might be unprovable. In my Nana's case, having to find her original birth certificate, just not going to happen.
Right, and so the point is that these laws on paper affect everybody equally, but in practice don't. And so when we make barriers, when we put up barriers to voting, the effect is often unequal.
I have a question here that says, has the lack of limited terms on judicial nominees, which is meant to shield them from politics, backfired, or has it become a bigger political issue than intended? I certainly have an answer on this. What do you think, Bruce?
I'm going to defer to you on this, Scott. You're the courts guy.
So, yeah, I mean, the idea of federal judges serving life tenure, the idea, as far as Alexander Hamilton is concerned, is to insulate them and allow them to make unpopular decisions without fear of reprisal, right? We can't vote them out of office, and we can't lower their paychecks. That's built in, that's baked into the Constitution in Article 3. Yeah, I think after 200 and plus years, what we've seen, and I'm speaking wholly on the Supreme Court level here, because there's just not as much evidence at the lower courts. At the Supreme Court level, at least, this insulation has actually fostered attitudinal voting. And what I mean by that is that somebody's political ideology is more dispositive of their vote, more so than the law or precedent or legal principles. And so it's actually fostered what seems to be a political court. And we see that in the nomination process, as we've seen, obviously. Their voting behavior while in the court, there's lots of evidence in certain subject areas that this happens. And we also see it on the retirements too. So they're timing their retirements so that a like-minded person might be able to fill their seat. And so if Alexander Hamilton's wish was to make a truly apolitical court, I think the structure actually fosters something wholly opposite of what he had hoped for. Let's see. Ooh, one more question. And I actually don't know the answer to this, and it's an excellent one. So what happens if I apply for an absentee ballot now while we're at school and then we get sent home due to COVID? Am I still allowed to vote in my hometown, or is there any process I have to go through to reverse the absentee ballot?
Depends on what your hometown is and what state it's in. There are probably 50 different answers to that question, depending on, and that's like
Yes.
one of the problems with the American electoral system, right?
Yes, yes.
It's all over the map. So I don't know. I probably wouldn't know anyway, but the best thing on that is to check with your home state.
I have a quick question, if there isn't another one there, Scott. You mentioned the Electoral College. Would it survive, two back-to-back popular winners not receiving the Electoral College win? We've had two in just the last 2 decades, 2000 election and the 2016 election. And you mentioned the constitutional amendment. If we are going to do away with it, officially we need the constitutional amendment. However, I'm curious, what about some of the movements to have states cast their electoral votes in a different way? Each state gets to decide how those votes are cast. Currently, 48 out of the 50 states send all of their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote within the state. But we do have 2 states right now who split it. And there's been a move, maybe to have a state cast all the electoral votes for the winner of the popular vote, for example, that movement after the last election. So what do you think about state-by-state changes to how those votes are cast and what impact that might have?
Yeah, I don't know that much about that. That's a great question, Beth. There's actually a compact out there now that several states have signed on to do
the popular vote compact.
The popular vote compact. Yeah, I don't know much about it. It's gotten some real steam. I suspect that it would pick up more should we see another election that repeats the popular vote winner losing the election. Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm going to point out just to that, I was talking to my class about this the other day, and I'm going to just say one last thing, because it's a good forum to say it. So, right, the 1876 election, right, where Rutherford Hayes runs against Tilden, right? And Tilden wins the popular vote in Hayes, but it's contested and it's decided by an elected commission, and they give, right, the election goes to Hayes, and what Hayes does to get the election is says, yeah, I'll be the Republican president, but I will pull all of the Northern troops out of the South, thereby ending Reconstruction and, in fact, ushering in one of the harshest periods in the South, the Jim Crow period. And so, over time, these elections and this Electoral College has been far from problem-free. And I think there have been some pivotal outcomes that have happened because of this. Even, we look at 2000, and I don't, this is not to say that somebody's done a bad job as president or a good job, but in 2000, right, the election was decided by, 537 contested votes in Florida, right?
Smaller than an incoming class in Gettysburg this election.
Yeah, exactly.
For perspective.
Right. And again, giving the election to the candidate who lost the popular vote. And so at some point, I think it's unclear how it would happen as a constitutional amendment, right? It's so difficult to amend the Constitution, and why would states that are advantaged by the Electoral College want to give it up?
Yes, Beth, you're actually spot on about that. I completely forgot about that. I actually think that's the in-between step before a full constitutional amendment, without a doubt. We're running out of time, and I wanted to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to thank everyone for coming, and also point out that this is going to be a series of events held between now and shortly after the election. We have some really great speakers lined up. This was just meant to be an overview, kind of what to keep your eyes open for. So be on the lookout in the digest and other announcements throughout the college about what's next. We hope you all attend that too. So thank you again for attending, and hope you all have a good night.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Beth, and thanks, Scott.